As a launch game, Condemned is probably one of the least marketable ones that I can think of. When you're designing a launch game, it would seem to follow that you'd want it to appeal to as wide of an audience as possible. It's certainly a little odd to be trying to launch a console with one of your major titles being a pretty niche feeling psychological horror game, a type of game that barely even existed at the time, at least in the way we would think of it these days, and a pretty major departure from where horror games were starting to head with the still very recent release of Resident Evil 4. That's not to say it has no value as a launch game. It absolutely was a graphical powerhouse at the time, and it's always incredibly useful to be able to show off the capabilities of a new system with a good looking game, but it still feels so incredibly out of place when put up beside its contemporaries like Perfect Dark Zero or Cameo. As obnoxious as it sounds on paper, there's a real sort of visceral tactility to the game as a whole. While the combat in all its forms may be very simplistic, it is constantly requiring you to go very hands-on with things. Whether it's breaking glass to get at a health pack, swinging a fire axe to get through a door, or physically using forensic tools instead of just hitting a single button, the game really wants you to engage with its world in a way that still feels really great today, even if it can become quite formulaic over the game's runtime. When you get to a set of stairs and the game artificially slows you down so you can't sprint up them, much like most people on a real set of stairs, is it annoying to have to do that? Absolutely. But I do respect the choice the developers made here, even though I will grant you that respect lessens somewhat when you discover that very shallow slopes have the same effect, or when you're stuck in a very slow walk while someone takes pot shots at you with no way for you to counter them. But while that focus on being so brutally tactile helps it still feel like it has some modern sensibilities now, there are other parts of it that feel positively ancient. There are a bunch of collectibles in each level that feel incredibly out of place and make me wonder if they were trying to do a collectathon here, with you picking up dead birds and pieces of metal. Though I will grant you it's likely it's just a symptom of how they really struggled often in the early 360 era to have things for achievements, and it's pretty easy to ignore. The voice acting can also be real hilarious, and the general plotting and story itself. While sometimes you get the feeling the game is really trying its best, things become almost laughable at other times, often helped along by the incredibly wacky physics of dead bodies taking you completely out of the atmosphere. In fact, even though this game is very clearly meant to be psychological horror, in practice for me it really only has the closet monster kind of horror, sometimes almost literally. To be sure, that's somewhat expected of this era, but I think I had given this game way too much credit from behind my nostalgia glasses before I sat back down with it. Now, all that being said, though, there are some things that are really still great about this game. A lot of the sound design is still legitimately excellent, and not only wouldn't sound out of place in a modern AAA release, but I honestly think works even better than they do. When I would hear some wood creak or glass break, it was maybe the most freaked out that I got in the whole game, and it always got me to instinctively glance around and discover new things about my environment, nabbing a quick peek of a future enemy that I'd have to fight eventually, scurrying over along the wall. In addition, a lot of the game's stylistic touches, meant to make it feel extremely modern and grounded, make it feel delightfully retro and nostalgic at this point in a way that I really enjoyed. In particular, I loved seeing the main character's candy bar style cell phone, which he spends a lot of time on conversing with a remote lab tech and a smattering of other characters. While the aforementioned forensic elements are scattered throughout the game and lead to you learning a bit more here and there about the mystery as you uncover it, at the heart of this game is, somewhat unfortunately, its clunky combat, While it is incredibly tactile, the combat loop basically revolves around swapping out weapons for one another. You'll often come across something in your path that requires you to use a specific weapon to get through. A padlock that has to be destroyed by a sledgehammer, or an electric lock that has to be speared with a shovel for some reason. Between having to deal with that and trying to make use of the limited but incredibly powerful firearms you find scattered about, you'll constantly be trading weapons for each other. And while I experimented a bit, taking the time to look at the stats the game displays for you while you're looking at one, I definitely came to have my favorites that I generally stuck to. Now, while you can, of course, shoot the guns until you run out of their extremely limited ammunition, when you're using a melee weapon, which you'll be doing most of the time, you really can only swing the weapon or use it to block. And I will say I definitely struggled at first with that combat, finding it hard to master the timing-based blocks with the really odd animations that the enemies do, until I learned just how overpowered the taser was. Definitely don't forget you have it like I did early on. It comes in so much handy when you're fighting against basically every enemy. It recharges very quickly given how slow most enemies move, and it has way more range than you'd think. The game is even courteous enough to upgrade it for you a certain bit into the story, which makes it even better than it already was. Even with that little trick in your back pocket, the combat does definitely get really repetitive and monotonous feeling by the end though, and of course they take away the taser for the final set of fights because they very much realized how overpowered it was. And sure, was the final boss fight maybe one of the most obnoxious, overwrought fights I've encountered lately? Sure. As a whole, is this game full of all of the things that made this period of transition between the console generations so incredibly awkward? Absolutely it is. It straddles the line between antiquated and innovative almost exactly. But despite all that, did I also have an absolute blast playing through it still, despite all that jank? A very definitive yes. With a handful of mods and a few minutes of figuring stuff out, you can easily get this game in a playable state on the PC, which is probably the easiest place to get it going unless you own a modern Xbox, since Condemned is indeed on the backwards compatible list for Xbox One and the Xbox Series consoles. The game is definitely before the time of decent controller support on PC though, so if you choose to play on PC, don't expect to get that without some controller to keyboard mapping, which will lose you the analog nature of the pad anyway. I did hit one really obnoxious soft lock, but it's hard to say whether it was PC specific or not, though it was a pain in the ass since I had to start the entire level over. Unfortunately, Condemned has been delisted on Steam now, on Halloween of all days. You can of course still get a hold of it in a number of different ways, but it's definitely gotten just a bit more difficult than it was even just a handful of months ago. But still, I think they're hoops well worth jumping through if you want to check out a game that, while so very representative of its time and place in so many ways, still remains incredibly interesting and fun to this day, as long as you're willing to learn to deal with those idiosyncrasies.